triggers a clash tied to a 57-year-old wrongful arrest involving her mother, forcing the town to confront a history it's tried to forget. What starts as quiet humiliation turns into a public reckoning that leaves the owner shaken, a veteran apologizing, and the whole community forever changed. In the moment that cracked the silence, what did Jasmine say? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Fresh from a grueling discrimination hearing in Georgia, Jasmine Crockett pulled into the lot of Dale's Diner. Just a roadside pit stop, nothing more. But nothing in Elmswood, Alabama ever stayed simple for long. The diner squatted at the corner of a quiet street, like a monument to everything this country hadn't resolved. Faded red siding, a neon sign that blinked Southern proud, and a sun-bleached Confederate flag decal curled at the edge of the window. Inside, a dusty radio played a mournful country tune, while the hum of old men in worn flannel filled the air like static. Jasmine stepped out, heels clicking against the cracked pavement, her navy suit still sharp from Capitol Hill. She wasn't here to make a statement, just to grab a bite and head home. But in this town, her presence was already a headline. She pushed the door open, the overhead bell ringing out like an alarm. And just like that, the air changed. The conversations didn't stop. They staggered. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Heads turned one by one, slow and calculating, like spotlights sweeping a dark stage. Jasmine moved toward the counter with quiet composure, but the tension wrapped around her like a second skin. The waitress behind the register, young, blonde with nervous eyes, looked to the back as if searching for backup. A pair of farmers by the window leaned in closer to whisper. One man in a camouflage jacket didn't even hide his smirk. Jasmine offered a polite nod and a good morning, but no one answered. The room had decided she didn't belong, and they didn't need to say it out loud. Her dignity was the only thing keeping her standing upright, because everything else in that room was working overtime to push her out the door. She stood still, spine straight, eyes forward, surrounded but not shaken. The weight in the room wasn't loud. It was heavier than noise. It was the kind of weight that tells you your presence is a disruption, even if no one says it aloud. Jasmine could feel it pressing against her chest as if the walls themselves were warning her to leave. Then came the soft squeak of hinges and a quiet shift in the air. From the swinging kitchen door, a man emerged, late 50s, with graying hair slicked back and a sweat-stained apron caked in flour. His boots thudded softly against the linoleum as he crossed the floor with the casual confidence of someone who'd been in charge of this place longer than anyone dared question. His name tag said Dale, but it wasn't necessary. The room had already deferred to him. Dale didn't smile. He didn't ask what she wanted. He didn't offer a seat or a menu. He just stopped a few feet from her, dish towel still in hand, and looked at her the way people look at a problem they've decided not to fix. There was no malice in his face, only the cold certainty of someone who felt no need to explain himself. Then calmly, as if he were commenting on the weather, he said, "I'm sorry, but we can't serve you here." The words were simple. The meaning was not. They came with history, with weight, with a message written between the lines. You're not one of us. You never were. And no matter how you speak, dress, or carry yourself, this place is not for you. Jasmine didn't move, didn't blink, but something in her chest pulled tighter. A familiar ache, rage, grief, and restraint, all twisted into one. She'd been here before. Not this town, not this building, but this moment. The one where respectability means nothing, where accomplishment can't shield you, where your very presence is treated like trespassing. And as she met Dale's eyes, steady and silent, she understood. This wasn't about policy or politics or even who she was. It was about who they'd already decided she couldn't be. The air between them held still, thick with everything Dale didn't want to say out loud. Jasmine's gaze didn't waver. Her voice, calm but sharpened by something older than this moment, cut straight through the tension. "May I ask why?" she said, each word deliberate, quiet but impossible to ignore. Dale shifted his weight slightly, eyes flicking toward the booths behind her, before settling back on hers. There was hesitation in the pause, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he knew exactly what he meant, and didn't want to be the one to say it plain. "It's just," he began, rubbing a hand over the back of his neck. "We don't really mix politics with breakfast around here. Folks come in to feel comfortable, not challenged. And people in this town, they've got strong feelings about what you stand for." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The implication hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Visible, acrid, and unmistakably intentional. Jasmine held his gaze. No anger, no sarcasm, just a single nod, slow and controlled, as if cataloging every layer of hypocrisy she'd seen play out in rooms like this one for decades. She'd been labeled many things in her life: lawyer, congresswoman, activist, but here this morning, in this room, she was being reduced to a threat. Not for anything she said, not for anything she did, but for existing in the space at all. Then it came, the break, the moment where disdain stopped pretending to be discomfort. From the back corner, a voice pierced the silence with calculated cruelty. "She's that troublemaker, isn't she?" A young man, maybe late 20s, slouched in his booth like he owned the place. Boots muddy and jacket ripped at the collar. He didn't say it to her face. He said it at her, like a rock tossed from a safe distance. "Saw her on TV once, screaming her head off, stirring up the kind of mess that turns towns like this upside down." A few chuckles followed, not loud but loud enough, and no one, not one person, told him to stop. That was the part that always hit the hardest, not the words themselves, but the silence that came after. The consent it carried. Jasmine turned slowly and without blinking toward the voice. She didn't speak. She didn't need to, because in that moment, her stillness was louder than all of them combined. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't blink. And most of all, she didn't get angry, because that's what they expected. That's what they were waiting for. Her silence unnerved them more than shouting ever could. The room, thick with judgment and tension, held its breath. Dale stood in front of her, arms crossed, jaw clenched, the unspoken weight of his position resting heavily in his posture. But Jasmine's gaze didn't waver. It didn't ask for understanding. It demanded clarity. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, but every syllable was deliberate, pressed out with the weight of 1,000 similar moments that had come before this one. "If I'm being turned away because of who I am," she said slowly, "then I think it's only fair that I hear that from the person who actually owns this place, not someone hired to speak for her." The room stilled. The kind of stillness that doesn't happen because people are listening, but because they've just been exposed. She hadn't raised her voice, but it cut through the air like a blade. No theatrics, no performance, just truth, spoken plainly, standing alone without apology. And that was what made it land so hard. Dale blinked. It was a blink that betrayed the shift, small but real. His shoulders dropped a fraction, the firmness in his stance beginning to slip. He wasn't used to being confronted without being attacked. He wasn't used to someone asking for the truth and doing it with such terrifying calm. The waitress behind the counter looked away, suddenly very interested in organizing sugar packets. Two men in a booth exchanged glances, but said nothing. And the young man in the back, the one who had laughed earlier, now leaned back just slightly, as if unsure whether to enjoy what was happening or prepare for something else entirely. Jasmine stayed still. She had no need to move. The burden was no longer hers. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She wasn't even asking for justice. What she asked for was far more uncomfortable: accountability. Dale hesitated, his lips parted, searching for something, an excuse, a way to soften what had just been exposed. But none came. Not one word could cover what had already been made plain. Finally, he exhaled, a sound more like resignation than relief, and gave a small, reluctant nod. "All right," he said, his voice quieter now. "I'll call her." And just like that, the illusion cracked. He turned and walked toward the back, through the kitchen doors, leaving behind the uncomfortable silence of a room full of people who had just watched a woman stand her ground. Not with anger, not with threats, but with the kind of stillness that speaks louder than any shout. And they all heard it, whether they wanted to or not. The door to the kitchen had barely stopped swinging when the murmur of voices returned, not as background noise this time, but as a quiet swarm, coiled tight with discomfort. No one dared speak directly to her, but the whispers were louder now, more pointed. Words were no longer casual, they were calculated. They drifted across the room in fragments, half muttered, fully intended. She's looking for trouble. Why'd she even come here? Always gotta make it political. The air felt different, tighter. It wasn't just the tension anymore. It was resistance. A collective pressure from the room, like a body bracing for something it didn't want to face. Jasmine sat alone at the counter, her back straight, her fingers gently resting on the black leather of her case. She didn't look around. She didn't flinch. Stillness for her was not surrender. It was strategy. A shield built from years of being judged before she spoke, dismissed before she stood, condemned before she arrived. From the corner booth near the window, a chair creaked. An older man shifted forward, resting both elbows heavily on the table, as if his entire body were made of weariness. His voice broke the hush, not loud, but unmistakably intended to carry. "We buried sons in this town," he said, his eyes not on Jasmine, but on some fixed point just past her shoulder. "Sons who bled on foreign soil. We didn't send them off to die so they could come back to a country torn apart by voices like yours." It wasn't a shout. It didn't need to be. It was the kind of statement meant to sound reasonable, measured, even noble. But the edges were jagged, and every word carried the weight of accusation disguised as patriotism. Jasmine didn't speak. Her jaw didn't tighten. Her hands didn't move. But her silence wasn't passive. It was the silence of someone who had heard this script before, who had memorized every line of it, every pause, every coded phrase. Ray, his name stitched in fading thread across a worn cap, didn't smirk. He didn't sneer. That would have made it easier to dismiss. No, what made his words land so hard was their calm delivery, as if he truly believed he was stating something honorable, as if his loss, his history, his grief gave him a license to silence her, as if pain gave permission for prejudice. Jasmine sat with perfect stillness, not because she had nothing to say, but because she understood the cost of saying it. A black woman raising her voice in a room like this doesn't get heard. She gets labeled. She becomes the headline, the problem, the one who started it. So instead, she let the weight of her silence do the talking. She kept her hands folded gently atop the document case in front of her, a case filled with sworn testimony, legal files, and the truth she had spent years gathering. And yet here she was, still being asked to prove she belonged. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was memory. It was strategy. It was resistance. And for everyone in that room who had hoped she would snap, who had waited for the permission to point and say, "See, she's one of those," her silence denied them that. She didn't need to meet Ray's eyes. The room had already felt her answer. "No, your sons didn't die so people like me could be erased quietly. No, your loss doesn't make this world yours alone. No, your sacrifice doesn't excuse shutting out a voice just because it dares to name injustice." And still, she said none of that aloud. She didn't need to, because somehow doing nothing, absolutely nothing, was more powerful than if she had said everything. The door opened again, this time slower, as if the air itself had thickened since Dale walked through it. What came next was not just a person, but a presence, a shift, a signal that the decision wouldn't be passed off anymore. Helen stepped into the room like someone who knew exactly what kind of place she was walking into, because she had built it with her own hands. 60, maybe older, with silver hair twisted into a tight knot at the base of her neck. She wore the uniform of someone who still worked the line. White apron dusted with flour, sleeves rolled to the elbow, a faint streak of grease near the collarbone. Her face was firm, lined not just by age but by years of being the one who made the final call when no one else would. Her eyes were sharp, alert, not angry, not welcoming, just calculating. She didn't speak right away. She didn't need to. First, she looked at Jasmine, head to toe, not in judgment, but in assessment, like a carpenter measuring material she wasn't sure would fit the frame. Then her gaze swept the room, quick, clean, precise. She saw everything, the way the waitress froze with the pot still in her hand, The stiff posture of Ray in the booth near the window, the pointed silence of the young man in the back, who'd earlier cracked a joke but now stared at his phone, scrolling nothing. She saw it all and said nothing, because she already knew. Jasmine rose slowly from her stool. There was no performance in it, no theatrics, just a movement done with the kind of grace that makes people realize too late that they've misread the moment. She faced Helen directly, hands still resting lightly on her briefcase, spine straight. The hush in the room was total now, dense, expectant, almost suffocating. And then Jasmine spoke, her voice clear, steady, and painfully human. "I came here today as a citizen," she said, not a flicker of defensiveness in her tone. Not as a congresswoman, not as a lawyer, not as someone looking to prove anything, just a woman traveling through looking for a meal and a moment of peace. She let the words settle. No rush, no panic. Then she continued, her voice still calm, but carrying something deeper now, a tired truth. "But if this place already decided what I am before I even placed an order, if your mind, or theirs, was made up the second I walked through that door," she drew a breath, "then I think I deserve to understand why. I'm not here to argue, I'm not here to demand. But if I'm not welcome, I want to hear that truth plainly, because if people like me can't even ask for breakfast without suspicion, then we're not just talking about politics anymore. We're talking about something much older than that." There it was, not an accusation, not a plea, just reality, spoken without apology, and it changed the temperature in the room. She didn't tremble. She didn't raise her chin or square her shoulders like she was gearing for a fight. She simply stood in full view, unarmed but undefeated, and in that stillness, the weight of everything she carried, history, expectation, scrutiny, pressed in, not just on her, but on everyone watching. The room wasn't quiet because it respected her. It was quiet because it didn't know what to do with someone who refused to shrink. And Helen just stood there, eyes locked with Jasmine's, as if trying to decide whether this woman in front of her was a threat or a test, or both. Helen didn't blink. She stood there, her posture as firm as the walls surrounding them, the faintest trace of flour still dusting her apron. The air between them felt heavier now, as if the weight of every word spoken and unsaid was pressing down all at once. Jasmine could feel it, could sense the quiet judgment building in the room, the collective exhale, the shift in the air. She knew what was coming, but it didn't make it any easier to hear. Helen's gaze didn't waver, her voice cutting through the silence with deliberate calm. "In this town," she said, her words measured but resolute, "many people see you as a symbol of division, not unity." Jasmine's heart didn't race, her pulse didn't speed up, but inside something shifted. The air around her thickened, and the sting of the words settled deep within her chest. This wasn't just a rejection. It wasn't even about her politics or her presence in the diner. This was something deeper, something that felt older than the town, older than the country itself. Helen wasn't just speaking for herself. She was voicing the collective frustration of every person in this room. Every person who had chosen comfort over change, division over conversation. Jasmine stood still, her fingers still resting lightly on her briefcase, a faint reminder of who she was and what she represented. And as Helen's words sank in, she realized that the deeper cut was in how easily Helen had dismissed her. Not for what she had said, but for what she was perceived to stand for. A person reduced to a symbol of everything this town feared. The words didn't shock her. They were familiar. They were echoes of conversations she had heard in different places, different times. The language of division, the choice to label someone as the other rather than trying to understand. She had heard it all before, from strangers, from allies who didn't want to be challenged, from people who believed that standing still meant safety. Helen wasn't speaking about her as a person. She was speaking about her as a concept, as a mirror to the parts of this country that still refused to look at itself in the light of truth. Jasmine didn't argue. She didn't need to. The truth was laid bare in Helen's words, in the way the room shifted when she walked in in the way they had already decided who she was before she even spoke. It wasn't a rejection of her actions, of her voice. It was a rejection of the very idea that change could be brought by people like her. It was a refusal to confront what was broken and a preference for the comfortable, stagnant quiet that came from avoiding the hard questions. And yet, even as the weight of Helen's words settled in, Jasmine didn't feel defeated. She felt something else, determined. Because no matter how many times people chose division over conversation, no matter how many times they refused to see the truth she carried with her, Jasmine knew one thing. She would never stop showing up. The room had settled into an eerie quiet, the kind that precedes an inevitable storm. Helen's words hung in the air like a heavy fog, thick with judgment and unspoken history. Jasmine's hands rested calmly on the counter, but her mind was anything but still. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had been dismissed by this town before. She had faced rejection from systems far larger than this diner, but today was different. Today, the injustice she faced wasn't from a policy, a law, or even a headline. It was from a generation's worth of fear, hate, and misunderstandings that had been passed down without ever being confronted. Jasmine knew that she had to stand firm, but she didn't need to shout. She didn't need to challenge them with anger. She had seen too many people try to fight this kind of battle with bitterness and resentment. It didn't work. What would work, what had always worked, was the truth. It was the truth they had all avoided, the truth they had tried to bury under years of silence. But she wasn't going to let that happen today. With a slow, deliberate motion, she opened her briefcase and took out a folded piece of paper. The edges were frayed with time, the yellowing of the paper a quiet testament to its age. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a letter that had been kept in her family's possession for decades, a letter that represented so much more than just words on a page. It was a letter from Helen's father, a man she had only ever known in stories that her mother had shared with her late at night. He had been the sheriff of Elmswood in 1966, the man who had orchestrated the wrongful arrest of Jasmine's mother, a moment that had torn their lives apart and left scars that still hadn't fully healed. Jasmine placed the letter gently on the counter, her fingers brushing over the faded ink as she did. She didn't look at Helen when she spoke next, but her words cut through the room like a blade. There was no venom in her voice, no accusation, just the calm, unshakable resolve of someone who had carried this weight for years and was finally choosing to set it down. "I didn't come here for vengeance," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I came here because I believe in the power of forgiveness, and I believe in the power of dialogue, not just between politicians or law enforcement, but between people, real people, who have been hurt by the same things, who have been misunderstood by the same things." She paused, letting her words hang in the space between them. This wasn't just about a letter or about the past. It was about an invitation to step out of the comfort of old prejudices and look at the truth for what it was. Not as something to be feared, but as something that could heal. The letter, placed delicately on the counter, wasn't just an apology. It was a bridge that connected the two women, not through the space of their current lives, but through the deep, painful history that had brought them here. It was a recognition that no matter how much time had passed, the wrongs could be acknowledged, could be forgiven. Jasmine had lived with that forgiveness, had learned to carry it in her heart, even when it was the hardest thing she could have done. "And this," Jasmine continued, her eyes finally meeting Helen's with quiet strength, "isn't about what happened to my family in 1966. This is about what happens next. If we keep ignoring the past, if we keep pretending it didn't happen, if we keep letting fear and resentment divide us, then we're going to lose something much bigger than just our trust in each other. We'll lose the chance to truly understand one another." Helen's gaze faltered for a moment, a flicker of something passing across her face. It wasn't guilt or shame, it was recognition. Recognition of a truth that had been hidden behind the walls of this diner for years. The room, once thick with division, felt different now. Heavier, yes, but also lighter, as if the space had opened up just a little. Helen looked at the letter, her fingers twitching slightly as if she wanted to reach out but hesitated. For the first time since entering, Jasmine felt the shifting of something in the room, a subtle, almost imperceptible change in the energy. The walls weren't as solid as they had been when she walked in. Helen hadn't dismissed her. Not yet. Jasmine wasn't asking for forgiveness. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She was asking for understanding, a willingness to listen, to see beyond the labels, the history, and the hurt. The letter from Helen's father wasn't a key to unlock all of Elmswood's pain, but it was a crack, a possibility for something different. And as Jasmine stood there, calm, with her truth laid bare in front of them all, the most important thing she had done was simply to show up, unafraid, unwilling to be silenced, and ready to stand for something bigger than the fight itself. The room had frozen in a silence so thick it felt like time had paused, not for effect, but from the sheer weight of what had just been placed on the counter. Jasmine's words, her presence, the faded letter from a former sheriff now long gone. It had all cracked the air like thunder. But it wasn't Jasmine who moved next. It wasn't Helen, not Dale, not even the ones who had whispered or sneered just moments ago. It was the soft scrape of a chair, slow and deliberate, that broke the spell. Every head turned toward the sound, as though pulled by a single string of instinct. From the corner booth near the window, the booth people usually left alone, not out of rudeness but respect, a figure rose, Mrs. Margaret Whitmore. She wasn't just a regular. She was an institution, the kind of woman who had attended every town council meeting for 30 years, brought casseroles to funerals, and still wrote handwritten Christmas cards to veterans' families she didn't personally know. She stood slowly, her joints clearly stiff with age, but her spine held dignity. Her white hair was coiled in a tight French twist, her blouse neatly pressed, a small silver cross at her neck that glinted in the light. She didn't speak right away. She didn't need to. The act of her rising alone seemed to hush the room further, not from fear, but from memory. When she finally spoke, her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was clear and calm, weathered but strong, like the ring of a church bell at dusk. "I saw her mother once," she began, her eyes on Jasmine and no one else. "Selma. March 1965. I was 19, standing on Water Avenue." A ripple moved through the room. Not a noise, just a subtle shift in the air, as if history itself had stepped inside. "My father took me there, against my mother's wishes, said I needed to see what conviction looked like. We didn't march, but we stood, watching." She paused, and her fingers lightly curled around the back of the chair in front of her, as if grounding herself in something far older than the wood. "I remember the heat. I remember the silence. But most of all, I remember her mother's face." Jasmine didn't move. Her breath slowed, but her posture didn't change. Her eyes stayed fixed on the woman now standing as her witness. "She wasn't yelling," Mrs. Whitmore continued. "She wasn't chanting. She didn't carry a sign. She walked, head high, shoulders square, her hands by her sides. There was no anger in her, just focus, just grace. And not once, not for a moment, did she look afraid." The room felt as if it had stopped breathing. "I see that same posture now, right in front of me," Mrs. Whitmore said. "You're not here to divide anyone. You're here because that's what your family taught you, to show up, to stand still when the world tries to make you sit down, just like she did." No one spoke. No one even stirred. Even the air conditioner, which had been humming steadily for the last half hour, seemed to hold its breath. For a brief moment, the divide between the past and present disappeared. Jasmine was no longer just a congresswoman or an outsider or a woman asking for coffee in a place that didn't want to see her. She was a continuation, a thread in a long, unbroken line of quiet resistance. A daughter whose story began before she was born, written in blood, protest, forgiveness, and survival. Mrs. Whitmore slowly lowered herself back into her seat. No flourish, no smile. She didn't look around for approval. She simply folded her hands in her lap, stared straight ahead, and sat like a woman who had seen something sacred and decided she would not allow others to forget it. The silence that followed was different now, heavier, no longer defensive, but reflective. Helen's eyes were still on the letter, but her jaw had slackened slightly. Dale glanced toward the back, unsure of what to do with his hands. The young man in the booth, the one who had mocked Jasmine earlier, now stared at the table like it might offer him a way out of his own discomfort. Even Ray, the grizzled vet who had spoken with such certainty, had nothing left to say. Because there, in the voice of an elderly woman who remembered the march and remembered the mother, was the undeniable thread connecting the moment they were in to a truth they could no longer deny. And for the first time since Jasmine had walked through that door, no one could pretend this was just about breakfast anymore. The silence that followed Mrs. Whitmore's words was no longer the kind born of tension. It was reverent, almost sacred. Something had shifted in the room, but no one could yet name it. The people inside Dale's diner, for the first time that morning, weren't reacting. They were listening, truly listening. Not to defend, not to argue, but because they had just heard something they hadn't expected. History spoken from memory, not from a textbook or a headline, but from someone who had stood there. Someone who had seen a young black woman walk through hatred with grace, and had now named that same grace in the woman standing before them. Helen remained standing behind the counter, still as glass, her arms hanging loosely at her sides now. Gone was the rigid posture of a woman protecting her establishment. In its place was something more fragile: contemplation. She stared at the letter on the counter like it was a relic, not a document. A living artifact that forced her to confront not only the actions of her father, but the silence that had followed them. Her father's badge had once hung in the diner's office, framed and polished. She had dusted it every Sunday, but she had never read that letter before. She had never seen her father's handwriting tremble, and now, looking at the daughter of the woman he had once wrongfully imprisoned, she understood why. Her throat moved once in a swallow that seemed to carry more than just discomfort. She didn't speak right away. She looked at Jasmine, not as a threat, not as a headline, but as someone impossibly real. Someone who had carried truth into a place that had survived on avoidance. It took a long time, 30 seconds, maybe more. But then she gave a single nod, slow and deliberate, and when she finally spoke, her voice was stripped of all performance. There was no strength in it, and that made it more honest. "Serve her," she said quietly, not to the room, not even fully to Dale, but to herself. Then more firmly, "And I'll sit with her." A beat passed. It didn't feel like surrender. It felt like surrendering to the truth, something much harder. Dale blinked, startled as if he hadn't expected her to say it out loud. He looked over at her, then at Jasmine, then at the letter, and for a second he looked almost lost. Not because he didn't know what to do next, but because he'd never been told to see her. Not really. She had been a name on TV, a headline, a controversy. Now she was a woman in his diner, and a woman his boss had just told him to serve. His hands moved slowly, as if every motion was suddenly too big. He reached for a mug, white porcelain, chipped at the handle. He held it like it might break. There was no flourish, no friendliness in the way he slid it across the counter toward Jasmine. Just a quiet, almost stunned compliance. For the first time that morning, it was clear. Dale didn't have control anymore, and Jasmine had never needed it. Jasmine, still seated, didn't react right away. She didn't speak. She didn't move. There was no gratitude in her silence, only understanding. She had never demanded to be welcomed. She had asked to be acknowledged. And this, however late, was a beginning. She reached forward with calm, deliberate hands and took the mug, holding it gently for a moment before setting it down beside the letter. Then, just as measured, she rose to her feet. The scrape of her chair echoed against the tile floor, drawing every eye. But she didn't glance around the room. She didn't need to. Helen stepped out from behind the counter, moving like someone carrying weight she hadn't expected to face that morning. Her steps were slow but not hesitant. There was no pride in her gait, but there was a quiet dignity, different from Jasmine's, but dignity nonetheless. She approached the table nearest the front window and pulled out a chair, nodding once to indicate Jasmine should join her. It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't an apology. It was a choice, one that had taken 60 years and one letter to make. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't offer absolution. She simply walked over and took the seat opposite Helen, placing her briefcase on the floor beside her, folding her hands atop the table. And in that stillness, something finally broke. Not Jasmine, not Helen, but the wall that had existed between them, the one built by years of silence and assumptions. Across the room, Marcus, the young man who had laughed earlier, his voice so smug only minutes before, was now reduced to stillness. He sat with his arms folded tightly across his chest, but the confidence was gone. He didn't lift his head. He didn't glance toward the table. He stared out the window with the hollow look of someone who had just seen something he couldn't explain and couldn't unsee. His smirk was gone. His posture was smaller now, as if the weight of what he had witnessed had settled on his shoulders too. And no one said a word. There was no applause, no declaration, just the quiet, undeniable truth of two women, one white, one black, one the daughter of a sheriff, one the daughter of a wrongfully arrested woman, now sitting across from each other for the first time, with nothing between them but the past, the present, and the possibility of something better. It wasn't justice, not yet, but it was the beginning of it. And everyone in that diner knew it. The room had begun to breathe again, but no one quite knew how. After the weight of the letter, the voice of Mrs. Whitmore, and the quiet command in Helen's decision, the world inside Dale's diner felt altered, like something had shifted beneath the floor without anyone seeing it move. And yet it held. Jasmine and Helen now sat face to face at a corner table, the sunlight bleeding softly through the window, cutting across the dust in the air like a spotlight on a scene no one had expected to witness. This wasn't a standoff anymore. It wasn't a debate. It was something far rarer. Two women tethered by history, pulled across generations, trying, despite everything, to understand one another. Helen spoke first. Her hands, once rigid with command, now rested loosely on the table. She didn't fidget, but her fingers curled slightly inward, the way someone does when their defenses have cracked but haven't collapsed. "You remind me of my mother," she said quietly. "She was hard on everyone, but hardest on herself. She'd call that strength. I used to call it being difficult." She exhaled, a small, almost bitter laugh behind her breath. "Now I think I get it." Maybe she was just tired of being told to wait her turn. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She let the words settle, then nodded slowly. "Women like that don't wait well," she said. "They spend their lives pushing against doors that were welded shut before they were born. Sometimes pushing is all they know." She didn't say it to accuse. She said it the way someone names a wound that's been ignored too long, gently but clearly. Her voice held no edge, but no softness either. She wasn't asking to be seen. She was stating that she had always been here. For a few minutes they talked, not about politics, not about parties, not even about the letter. They talked about mothers, about daughters, about what it meant to raise children in a country that still hadn't decided what kind of future it truly wanted. They didn't agree on everything. They didn't try to. Helen spoke of the fear she felt watching the news, watching cities burn, watching words shouted that she didn't understand. Jasmine spoke of the fear she felt walking into rooms where her name arrived before she did. Rooms that had already decided who she was. They didn't trade arguments. They exchanged truths. And in that rare space between them, something else began to build. Something not as heavy as trust, but heavier than tolerance. At one point, Helen looked down at the table and said, almost to herself, "I used to think people like you wanted to tear everything down." Jasmine didn't blink. "I want to know who the house was built for before I start fixing the roof," she replied. Helen nodded, slowly, as if that, somehow, made a kind of sense that no one had ever said out loud to her before. Time passed. Coffee cooled. Conversations resumed quietly at the edges of the room. But no one forgot what was happening in that corner. It was more than a conversation. It was an undoing, and maybe the start of a rebuilding. As Jasmine stood to leave, she reached for her briefcase and paused for a second, just enough to look back at Helen. "Thank you for listening," she said. It wasn't ceremonial, it wasn't diplomatic, it was sincere. Before Helen could reply, a shadow stepped forward from the far side of the diner. Ray. He had watched the entire exchange from a distance, never looking away, never interrupting. The same man who had earlier told her his son hadn't died for a country that allowed people like you to cause chaos, now walked slowly across the room. Not with hesitation, but with the weight of something unspoken. He stopped in front of Jasmine, eyes level, jaw tight. There was no shame in his face, but there was something harder to earn: humility. A veteran's kind, the kind that doesn't bend easily, but knows when it must. I still don't agree with everything you stand for, he said, voice gruff but level. Probably never will. Jasmine waited. But I was wrong about you, he added. I thought you'd come in here loud, demanding, ready for a fight. You didn't. You showed up. You stood still. And you stayed when it got ugly. Most folks don't. His hand, rough with calluses and history, extended slowly toward her. That I can respect. Jasmine looked at the hand for a brief moment, then took it. The handshake was firm, not performative, not for the benefit of anyone watching. Just two people who, for the briefest moment, saw each other not as enemies, but as citizens of the same fractured country, holding opposite truths, but sharing one moment of peace. Ray stepped back without another word. He returned to his seat, but this time he didn't look out the window. As Jasmine turned to leave, the bell above the door chimed gently, just as it had when she entered. But now it sounded different, not like a warning, more like a punctuation mark. She paused in the doorway, looked back one last time. Not for validation, not for permission, but to say what needed to be said. We don't have to be the same, she said clearly, her voice reaching every corner of the diner. But we can share the same space, if we're willing to listen. And with that, she walked out. The door closed softly behind her. The sunlight beyond the glass caught the edge of her briefcase as she disappeared down the steps and back into the day. Unchanged in her purpose, but having changed something in the room behind her that would not soon return to what it was. Inside the diner, no one spoke for a long time. Not because there was nothing to say, but because, for the first time, they knew it mattered how they said it. The door clicked shut behind her with a softness that belied the weight of what had just taken place. And still no one moved. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel empty, but haunted. The kind that doesn't ask for words because everyone is still trying to remember how to think. In the wake of Jasmine's departure, Dale's Diner felt less like a place and more like the hollowed-out shell of one, a building caught mid-transformation between what it had always been and what it could never be again. Plates sat half-finished. Coffee had gone cold. Conversations that had once flowed with easy laughter and local gossip now hovered uncertainly in people's throats. Dale leaned on the counter like he always did, but his fingers tapped against the surface in a restless, uneven rhythm. The usual soundtrack of country radio had gone quiet. He'd forgotten to restart the music after hitting pause. And Helen hadn't moved. She still sat at the table where Jasmine had been. Her posture had shifted, no longer guarded, but emptied. Her hands were folded together on the surface of the wood, resting exactly where Jasmine's mug had once been. The white ceramic was still there, rim stained with a trace of lipstick and silence. Helen stared at it, as if it might still offer answers. The letter, her father's letter, was folded carefully beside it, but she hadn't touched it again. No one dared interrupt her. From the far end of the room, a chair scraped back slowly. Marcus, the young man who had made the first joke, the first smirk, the first judgment, stood awkwardly, his shoulders slouched forward like a man who had just been handed something too heavy to carry. He didn't say a word. He walked to the counter, placed a crumpled 20 beside his untouched plate, then turned to go. Just before he reached the door, he paused. His eyes flicked toward Helen, then to the table where Jasmine had sat, and then down to the floor. He left without looking back. The bell above the door gave a weak jingle as it shut behind him, the sound smaller now, like even it had learned to be quiet. Outside, the sun climbed a little higher in the sky, but inside the diner, the light felt harsher, more revealing. It streamed through the front windows, cutting sharp angles across the booths, dust catching in the golden shafts like memory suspended in motion. Ray sat alone near the window, his posture rigid. One hand rested on his thigh, the other clenched loosely around a coffee cup he hadn't sipped from in 10 minutes. His eyes weren't on the room. They were far away, on a battlefield maybe, or a memory, or the place where regret starts to root itself when pride finally steps out of the way. Dale poured himself a glass of water and drank it too quickly. Then he refilled it. No one had told him to do anything, but doing something felt better than doing nothing. The dishwasher in the back clanged faintly. He had left it running earlier, unaware. Now its hum felt like a lifeline to normalcy, to routine. But it didn't work. Not anymore. The waitress who had frozen at the register earlier moved gently between tables, refilling cups, not saying much. She nodded politely to customers and made a point of asking Ray if he wanted a fresh pour. He declined with a slight shake of his head, eyes still fixed on the window as if waiting for something, or someone, to return. Helen finally reached for the letter. Her fingers touched the paper like it might vanish. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. She had read the words once. Now they lived in her chest like an old injury finally acknowledged. She folded it again, more carefully this time, and slid it into the front pocket of her apron. Then she stood, slowly, deliberately, and carried the empty coffee mug back behind the counter herself. No one said a word, because everyone in that room, whether they admitted it or not, understood the same truth. Something had ended. Not the conversation, not the conflict, but the illusion that this diner, this town, this country could keep running on silence. And outside, down the road, Jasmine Crockett kept walking. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The aftershock would take care of itself. It wasn't until the diner had emptied that Helen realized how still she was. The chairs had been reset, the plates cleared. The bell above the door hadn't jingled in nearly 20 minutes. And yet, Helen remained rooted in place behind the counter, one hand resting on the cold porcelain mug Jasmine had left behind, the other loosely cradling the folded letter in her apron pocket. She felt like a ghost in her own business. For years, Dale's diner had been her sanctuary, her inheritance, her control. She knew the rhythm of it better than she knew the rhythms of her own breath. She could tell which regular was coming just by the cadence of their boots across the floor. She could fry eggs and count change at the same time without thinking. She was the woman who knew how many packets of sugar went into Ray's coffee when Marcus would come in hungover, and exactly how many minutes the jukebox took to warm up in winter. But today she had been a stranger behind her own counter, and now the weight of it pressed on her chest like a truth too long denied. She reached into her apron pocket and slowly pulled out the letter. Her fingers trembled. It wasn't age. It was knowing. Knowing that this piece of paper, this fragile slip of memory, had been in someone else's hands for decades while she lived under the illusion that she understood her father. She unfolded it carefully, smoothing the creases out along the countertop like she was unwrapping a confession. The handwriting was unmistakable. Her father's. She hadn't seen it in years, but it came back to her instantly. The slightly crooked S, the way he pressed harder on the first letter of every sentence. He had written this, to a black woman, to Jasmine's mother, an apology, signed with his name, Sheriff Walter S. Kendrick, the man who had been her rock, her compass, her foundation, the man who had stood in her kitchen every Sunday, reading scripture with his thumb tucked into the spine of the Bible, the man whose photograph hung in her office, dressed in full uniform, frozen in a smile that now looked unfamiliar. She had worshipped him, and he had written this letter in silence, without ever telling her. What did that mean? What did that say? She read the letter again, this time slower. Words like misjudgment, wrongful, apology jumped out at her like bullets. Her breath caught at one line in particular. I carried out the law that day, but I did not carry out justice. And for that, I owe you something I can never repay. Helen stared at that sentence as though it were a sentence handed down to her, not him. It echoed in her mind like a verdict read aloud in a courtroom she didn't know she'd been sitting in her entire life. Justice was not done in your name, she thought. But you let me believe it was. The truth was unraveling her carefully folded world. She had inherited more than a business from her father. She had inherited silence. She had inherited a place built on knowing what not to ask. She had heard stories, of course, rumors of that arrest, murmurs of what really happened. But she had never asked, never wanted to know. And now here it was, on her counter, on her conscience, staring back at her through a daughter's eyes, Jasmine's eyes. Helen sat down slowly, her knees tight and tired from a morning that had bent her in ways no shift ever had. She looked across the table at the empty chair where Jasmine had sat and felt for the first time in years that she was not in control of her space. The diner no longer belonged only to her, not morally, not emotionally, because something had been named here, something she couldn't unhear, not politics, not partisanship, truth. The kind that comes with a quiet face and a patient voice, the kind that walks in through the front door and asks for nothing but a cup of coffee and the dignity of being seen, and the kind that lingers long after that person has walked out. Helen folded the letter again, this time with more reverence, and slipped it back into her apron like someone tucking away a sacred object. She didn't know what she would do with it yet. Maybe she'd frame it. Maybe she'd write her own letter and deliver it herself. She didn't know, but she knew this. The next time someone like Jasmine walked into her diner, she would not be surprised, because today she had finally looked inward, and what she saw was not cruelty, but cowardice. And cowardice, she realized, is just another word for comfort when it's chosen over courage. She stood again, slower this time, worn, not from work, but from truth. The photograph of her father still hung on the back office wall. She looked at it now, and for the first time it didn't offer strength, it offered accountability. She walked back to the photo, removed it from the nail, looked at it for a long moment. Then she set it face down in the drawer. Not as an erasure, but as a reckoning, and she locked the drawer with shaking hands, whispering aloud to the empty room, "I should have asked more questions." By the time the clock tower in Elmswood chimed 7 the next morning, the events at Dale's Diner had already begun to mutate, softened in some corners, sharpened in others. The town didn't have breaking news alerts or TV reporters camped on its sidewalks. It had something older, more efficient: gossip, shame, pride, and memory. The first retelling happened not in headlines but in eye contact, in the way two men who usually nodded politely outside the feeding grain suddenly held each other's gaze half a second longer. The way mothers looked up from their grocery lists when someone mentioned that woman near the produce aisle, and how conversations now came with cautious pauses. The diner incident, some refused to call it anything more than that, didn't scream its way through Elmswood. It whispered, insisted, haunted. By 8, local Facebook groups were lighting up, screens filled with speculation, screenshots, and blurry images. One photo in particular showed Jasmine Crockett seated across from Helen, her hands calmly folded on the table, her expression unreadable. Helen leaned forward in that image, face taut with something between skepticism and surrender. No food between them, just silence and decades. One user posted, "Didn't see that on the menu." Another replied, "Looks like something finally got served." Beneath the snide comments came a quieter layer. Teachers who had taught both Helen's children and Jasmine's niece chimed in. "I don't care what side you're on. She carried herself with more grace than most of us would have." A Black War veteran posted a single sentence. "I've eaten at Dale's since 1973. Not once did I feel seen in that room. Yesterday changed something." By 10, the Elmswood Weekly Gazette's homepage posted a brief write-up under the heading, "A Table Between Generations, Diner Encounter, Sparks Reflection." The article was cautious, almost clinical. No mention of the letter, no names except Helen's, and even that was quoted lightly. But the headline was enough. The Gazette hadn't used the word reflection in years. Usually stories were about lost dogs, church bake-offs, and the annual Veterans Day parade. This one felt different. It felt nervous. At the high school, teachers held whispered conversations in the break room. One math teacher, a white woman in her 50s, asked if anyone had seen the full video. "No video," someone responded. "Only memory." That answer stuck with her all day. She repeated it to herself like a problem she couldn't solve. At the salon, 3 women sat under dryers arguing about what Jasmine had said or hadn't said. None of them had been there. But they debated like they had. When the stylist, a younger Latina woman, said, "You know, I'd have probably walked out if I were her," the room went quiet. Someone muttered, "That's because you don't understand how small towns work." She looked up through the mirror and replied evenly, "Maybe that's the problem. We're too afraid to say they're broken." At the VFW, Ray sat alone at the corner table, nursing a single beer well past the time it had gone warm. He didn't tell the story. He didn't have to. The others watched him closely, waiting for a snide comment or a dismissal, but it never came. Instead, when someone finally said, "Heard you shook her hand," Ray just nodded. "Yeah," he said. "I did. Felt right." No one mocked him for it. They just moved on to the next round of cards. But everyone knew something had changed. The ripple extended beyond conversations. It became action too, small at first. That same day, a librarian pulled a stack of books on civil rights and placed them in the front display. A father stopped by the diner with his teenage daughter and told her quietly before they entered, "Pay attention to how people treat each other today." A black waitress at a diner 2 counties over heard someone say Jasmine's name and pause, wondering if, just maybe, things were starting to feel a little less impossible. Meanwhile, Helen was still navigating her own shift, not just socially, but inside. She came into Dale's earlier than ever, and scrubbed the counters not because they needed it, but because her thoughts wouldn't stop moving. Every motion was loaded with memory, every dish, every stool, every faded newspaper clipping on the bulletin board now felt like part of a story she hadn't been honest about. She thought about her father often that day. She thought about what he didn't tell her, but more than that, she thought about what she had never questioned. When a young black woman came into the diner around lunchtime, Helen walked up to her personally and said, "Welcome. Here or to go?" The woman blinked, startled, then smiled and said, "Here, if that's all right." Helen nodded. "Of course it is." That moment wasn't performative. It wasn't political. It was human. And still the town kept talking. On the third day after the diner incident, a group of high school seniors asked to host a community discussion in the church basement. The flyer read, "We're not asking you to agree, just to listen." Some laughed at it, others showed up, but the room was packed, and when Jasmine's name was brought up, there were no boos, no applause, just silence. The same silence she had held in that diner, the same silence that had made people stop and feel instead of argue. In that silence, people remembered what had happened and what hadn't. Not everyone agreed with what she stood for, but more people than ever before were starting to wonder what it said about them, that she had walked into their town with truth and composure, and they had almost made her leave before she even ordered a cup of coffee. Some couldn't sleep that week, others slept better than they had in years. No laws changed, no banners were raised, but Elmswood wasn't quite the same, and neither was Helen. Because now, when the bell above the diner door chimed, it no longer meant business as usual. It meant someone was walking in, and this time, they might be seen. And as the days moved on and Elmswood slipped back into its familiar rhythm, the weight of what happened at Dale's diner didn't disappear. It sank deeper, not like a wound, but like a seed. Jasmine hadn't yelled, hadn't lectured, hadn't demanded anything but dignity. Yet with a letter, a gaze, and an unwavering calm, she had peeled back something raw in the heart of that town. She didn't storm the place. She stood in it. And that, more than anything, forced everyone to question what kind of silence they'd been living with for far too long. The lesson wasn't wrapped in politics. It wasn't partisan. It was painfully human. Jasmine faced a room designed to exclude her, not with violence, but with polite denial. And instead of meeting hostility with fire, she met it with history, humility, and the kind of stillness that made others shift in their seats. She didn't win anyone over with slogans. She disarmed them with truth. Her presence alone asked the question, why is being different still treated as a threat? What she showed Elmswood, and anyone listening, is this: coexistence doesn't require sameness. It requires courage. The courage to stay at the table. The courage to hear before you respond. And above all, the courage to admit when silence has been your safest lie. Jasmine didn't change the world in that diner, but she did something braver. She made it impossible to look away. And for a town that had long chosen comfort over confrontation, that was more than enough to begin. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. In a packed federal courtroom streamed to over 62 million Americans, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett is blindsided by Justice Clarence Thomas, who strips her of her seat and bans her from running for office for 10 years, without allowing her a single word in her defense. But just 5 minutes later, she turns the entire hearing on its head, pulling out a sealed envelope that reveals what the court never wanted the public to see: secret luxury gifts, hidden relationships, and rulings that now look like deals. The judge is shaken, the nation erupts, and the foundation of the system begins to crack. What did Jasmine say that made the most powerful man in the room fall completely silent? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. It was just past 8:15 a.m. when Jasmine Crockett stepped through the towering glass doors of the Atlanta Federal Courthouse. The frost hadn't yet melted from the marble steps, but the chill that awaited inside had nothing to do with weather. Her name was plastered across every journalist's tablet outside. Crockett accused of ethics violation, hearing in 45 minutes. No preparation, no prior notice, just a single email at midnight, summoning her to answer for a charge so vague it bordered on fiction. Improperly accepting charitable donations through Hope Forward, the same program that had fed thousands during the pandemic. She arrived with nothing but a briefcase and her composure. What no one could explain, even now, is why Justice Clarence Thomas, a sitting member of the United States Supreme Court, was the one presiding. This was not a constitutional challenge. This was not a federal appeal. This was a basic ethics hearing wrapped in legal theater. Yet there he was, seated behind the elevated bench in his black robe, unsmiling, eyes low and heavy. When he entered the room, a hush followed, more fear than respect. The air turned tight. Jasmine's attorney leaned in and whispered, "This isn't a hearing. It's a setup." Jasmine stood as the clerk read out the charge. She raised her hand to speak, but Thomas cut her off mid-breath. "This is not a forum for grandstanding," he said, the words dry and final. She tried again, to clarify, to ask for time to review evidence, to defend the integrity of Hope Forward. Again, the gavel struck. "You are not entitled to editorialize," he snapped. It wasn't just unorthodox, it was authoritarian. Every safeguard of due process, every norm of fairness was dismantled in real time, before a silent courtroom and live-streamed audience of millions. And then, without witness testimony, without cross-examination, without even a formal motion to deliberate, came the blow. "It is the decision of this court," Thomas declared, "that Representative Jasmine Crockett is suspended from her office and barred from seeking or holding any elected position for a period of 10 years. No hesitation, no emotion, just a verdict that struck with surgical cruelty. Gas rippled through the courtroom like thunder behind glass. A woman in the gallery dropped her coffee. One young man shouted, "This is insane!" before being escorted out. Cameras didn't blink. Reporters typed like stenographers at war. But Jasmine remained still. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. Her stillness was louder than any protest. It wasn't acceptance. It was restraint. Because she knew something the court didn't. This wasn't the end of her fight. It was the beginning of their exposure. Outside, within moments, headlines screamed across every screen. Crockett silenced. Thomas delivers stunning blow. Justice or ambush? Power protecting power? And buried between lines of speculation, one quote from a Georgetown law professor summed up the nation's unease. This wasn't a legal proceeding. It was a warning to every voice that challenges comfort, wealth, and legacy. What Jasmine had just endured wasn't merely unjust. It was designed to be humiliating. But beneath the silence of her exit, there was something brewing, something no robe, no bench, no billion-dollar alliance could contain. As the echo of the gavel faded and the official verdict sealed her political fate, Justice Clarence Thomas leaned forward, not to conclude the hearing, but to humiliate her. What he said next wasn't law. It was personal. "You are not here because you serve the people," he said, his voice sharpened by something colder than authority. "You are here because of partisan privilege, because your party protects its own." The words hung in the courtroom like a stain that couldn't be scrubbed clean. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The accusation cut deeper precisely because of how calmly it was delivered. For a split second, the room froze, not from respect, but from the weight of what had just been said. Cameras zoomed in. Staffers stiffened. Her lawyer began to rise but paused when Jasmine did nothing. Nothing but blink once. She remained seated, hands folded on the table before her. But inside her mind, the past, her real past, began to rise, uninvited and undeniable. She was 16. No cameras, no bench, no protection. Just pavement and flashing lights. She had taken the long route home after a double shift at the corner diner in Highland Park, still wearing her name tag, still holding a bag of leftover fries meant for her younger brother. That night, 2 patrol cars stopped her less than 5 blocks from home. "You don't belong in this neighborhood," one officer said as he reached for her arm. When she asked what she did wrong, they told her she fit a description. No warrant, no explanation, no apology. She was thrown in the back of the cruiser like she didn't exist. In the holding cell, she watched time move like it hated her until morning came and they let her go without a word. No charges, no record, just trauma tucked into silence. That moment didn't make her bitter. It made her precise. It didn't teach her to hate power. It taught her how it moved, how it spoke, how it hid behind legalese. That's why she went to law school, not to wear the robe, but to confront those who misused it. She defended clients who had no one. She took cases no one else would. She stood in courtrooms with secondhand shoes and a voice full of purpose. While others raised millions from super PACs, she raised hope, one conversation at a time, one vote at a time. Her campaign was built not in back rooms, but in barbershops and church basements. And now the man who had spent decades surrounded by billionaires dared to call her privileged. So no, she didn't speak, because words would have made it smaller. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was defiance held in its purest form. The courtroom thought she was sitting still, but something in her posture had changed. Subtle but seismic. Not a woman defeated, a woman calculating. Because she knew what Clarence Thomas had just done wasn't a sentence. It was a mistake. And mistakes in her world had consequences. And just as the courtroom settled into the false calm of recess, papers rustling, murmurs rising, something far more dangerous than noise passed beneath the table. A quiet act of defiance wrapped in gold. Jasmine had barely stepped off the witness platform when she felt it. An almost imperceptible tap against her fingertips, followed by the smooth edge of a sealed envelope. It was Marcus Hale, her longtime ally and perhaps the only person in the room who understood the full weight of what was unfolding. He didn't make eye contact. He didn't need to. Their work had never relied on words when the stakes were this high. The envelope was slim, precise, and gold. Oddly elegant, yet unassuming enough not to raise alarms. Jasmine slid it under her legal notepad as she returned to her seat, her face unreadable. Moments later, Justice Thomas called a 20-minute recess. Lawyers stood, clerks buzzed around like wasps let loose, and the media whispered into microphones, speculating over optics and outcomes. But Jasmine sat motionless, back straight, hands resting on the desk like a statue carved out of purpose. Her fingers found the envelope again, only this time they peeled it open. What unfolded before her was not evidence. It was revelation. The first document was a financial ledger, cleanly formatted but damning in its clarity. She scanned it with disciplined focus. Private lodging, Amalfi Coast, $56,800, paid by H. Crow. Her eyes moved line by line, expression fixed, as if she were simply reviewing case notes. Tuition paid for great-nephew, $103,000. No federal disclosure filed. Another page. Patek Philippe luxury watch, estimated $71,000, hand-delivered. Jasmine's stomach didn't drop. It anchored. This wasn't rumor or innuendo. This was paper, dates, values, signatures. And then she saw the line boxed in thick red ink near the bottom of the last page. Timeline cross-reference. 7 Supreme Court rulings with financial implications for Crow Holdings and affiliates. Gifts documented within 10 to 14 days of each ruling. She leaned back slowly, the weight of truth settling over her like armor. It was stunning, yes, but it was also familiar. She had seen injustice before. She had lived it. But this was institutional rot dressed in black robes, an ancient precedent. She looked around the courtroom. The cameras were still on. The American public was still watching. They had seen a woman silenced, a verdict rushed, a life's work condemned in under an hour. But what they hadn't seen, yet, was the moment power gets caught red-handed. And Jasmine Crockett was not the kind of woman who let truth die in silence. Now armed with proof that could shake the very foundation beneath the judge's seat, Jasmine didn't rise for redemption. She rose for something far more dangerous: clarity. When the court reconvened, the room felt heavier. The gavel struck once, sharp, abrupt, almost irritated, and murmurs died in mid-breath. Jasmine stood up slowly, deliberately, before being addressed. Her hands remained at her sides, her posture unshakable. She looked not at Thomas, but forward, like she was speaking to something larger than the court. "Your Honor," she said evenly, each syllable firm without being confrontational, "I respectfully request to make a brief clarification regarding the record and the implications made about my character." Her tone didn't waver. It didn't plead. It simply existed, like something immovable. Justice Clarence Thomas didn't immediately respond. He adjusted his glasses, eyes flicking briefly toward the press gallery, where over a dozen reporters sat poised with notepads, phones, and unblinking expressions. The pressure was real now. He could feel it, not just from her, but from beyond the courtroom walls. Journalists lived tweeting every inflection, legal analysts dissecting his bias in real time, public opinion tightening like a noose. "This proceeding is concluded," he replied flatly, resting his hand near the gavel again. "There is nothing more to add." Jasmine held her ground. She didn't protest. Instead, she said one line, quiet, pointed, undeniable. "Then let the record reflect that denying the truth is not the same as disproving it." It wasn't a threat. It was a warning, and it landed with far more weight than any objection could. A few members of the press visibly leaned forward. One camera zoomed closer. A silence followed. Dense, charged, the kind that makes even a judge question whether to proceed. Thomas glanced toward a clerk, then back at Jasmine, then at the door, calculation flickering just beneath the surface. With a voice far less certain than before, he muttered, 2 minutes. Stay within the bounds of relevance." Jasmine gave the slightest nod. No smile, no gloating. She simply stepped toward the microphone, a folder in hand and fire in her chest. Because she wasn't here to ask for fairness anymore. She was here to deliver it, with 2 minutes granted and the eyes of a nation watching. Jasmine didn't just approach the microphone. She approached history, carrying truth like a torch into a room designed to keep it in the dark. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The weight of her words would come from precision, not volume. Jasmine opened the manila folder slowly, her fingers careful, not theatrical, as if handling something sacred. One by one, she lifted the documents, clean, dated, irrefutable, and held them before her like surgical instruments, prepared for an operation that had waited too long. "Your Honor," she began, her tone measured but unmistakably firm, "I have been accused today of accepting lawful donations from a nonprofit that feeds children, funds housing, and uplifts neglected communities. For that, I was condemned without defense. Yet what I hold in my hand are records of undisclosed gifts, gifts received by a sitting Supreme Court justice from private billionaires with direct interest in federal rulings." She let that sentence settle. It didn't fall. It landed hard. She read aloud. "Private yacht accommodations in the Amalfi Coast, valued at $56,800. Paid for by Harlan Crow." She didn't look at Thomas yet. She turned to the room. tuition payments totaling $103,000 for a relative, no disclosures filed, no questions asked, a luxury Patek Philippe watch valued at $71,000, delivered by hand. And all of this, she paused, lifting the final sheet, cross-referenced with 7 federal rulings that directly impacted the financial interests of the gift giver. 7, all ruled in their favor. There was no noise in the room, no coughs, no shifting chairs, just breath held in collective suspension. Then she looked up, directly at him, not with contempt, not with triumph, but with clarity. "Your Honor," she said slowly, each word as deliberate as a chisel-breaking stone, "if I can be disqualified for documented contributions used for public good, then let me ask you, with full respect to this institution, who investigates the justice who receives private luxury from those who benefit by his hand? Who holds power accountable when power wears a robe?" The silence that followed wasn't just shock, it was recognition. Recognition that something sacred had just been said out loud. Something usually whispered in back rooms, avoided on headlines, or buried under layers of decorum. But not today, not anymore. Jasmine hadn't come to defend herself. She had come to remind the court that even justice must answer to justice. Jasmine had not come to plead for justice. She had come to peel back its mask. And now, with every eye fixed on her and every screen broadcasting live, she pulled the truth into the light, one fact at a time. She pressed the remote with the quiet certainty of someone who no longer needed permission to speak. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the projection screen flickered to life. The first image was unmistakable. Clarence Thomas sat in the sun-drenched lounge of a private yacht, a glass of champagne in hand, the cliffs of Italy rising behind him like a postcard for a world the average citizen would never see. The watermark in the corner marked the date, May 24th. Jasmine didn't narrate with outrage. She let the photo breathe, its implications loud enough. Then came the second slide, an official court docket from the very same day. Thomas v. Crow Holdings, a case involving the interests of the very billionaire who had financed the trip. Jasmine let the two images linger side by side. The contrast didn't need embellishment. She advanced again. This time, a spreadsheet, tightly formatted, methodical. It listed 7 different rulings across 5 years, each one involving entities connected to Harlan Crow or his business interests. Each one ended with a decision that favored him, and each one, Jasmine noted aloud, coincided with a gift: flights, lodging, tuition payments, even a rare $71,000 Patek Philippe watch. "These aren't coincidences," she said calmly. "They are data points. And when the highest court in the land becomes indistinguishable from the favors it receives, we are no longer governed by law. We are governed by arrangements." Then she turned toward the courtroom and said, "Mr. Reuben Glassman, please step forward." The former clerk walked to the microphone slowly, like a man who had carried his silence too long. He wore no robe, no badge, just a gray suit and the look of someone about to lose whatever protection anonymity had offered him. He unfolded a piece of paper, hands steady but voice restrained. "I served as scheduling and records coordinator under Justice Thomas," he began. "In mid-2021, I was directed to remove flight manifests and calendar entries that linked the justice to properties owned by Harlan Crow." He looked up, the words suddenly heavier. "I was told it was for clarity. I said no. A week later, my access was revoked. A month later, I was gone." The room didn't erupt. It imploded, silently, inward, as the enormity of what had just been confessed settled into the floorboards and the faces of every person present. Even the courtroom guards, who just hours ago had glanced past Jasmine like she was a formality, now stood stiff, uncertain. Jasmine said nothing. She didn't move. She let the silence deepen until it became undeniable. Then she turned, not toward the audience, not toward the press, but toward the one man who hadn't yet spoken. Justice Clarence Thomas. He wasn't leaning forward anymore. He had shrunk somehow, pulled back into his chair, like a man hoping the wood might swallow him whole. His hands were no longer folded. They gripped the armrest with whitened knuckles. His gaze, once fixed and imperious, now flickered unfocused, as if searching for the nearest escape. But there was none, and that's when a voice, clear, calm, unmistakably human, rose from the back of the gallery. "Your Honor, is there anything you'd like to say?" No answer came, not even a blink, just the sound of a breath caught somewhere between shame and silence. And in the seconds that followed the question, "Is there anything you'd like to say?" what had once been unthinkable now hovered palpably in the air, that the man behind the robe might finally be the one on trial. Justice Clarence Thomas straightened in his chair, or at least tried to. His fingers gripped the edge of the bench with visible effort, as if holding on to the authority that had, for so long, gone unchallenged. But authority only works when people believe in it, and belief was evaporating fast. The room had shifted. The silence that once followed his gavel now belonged to Jasmine Crockett. The courtroom was no longer a stage for punishment. It had become a mirror, and the reflection looking back at Thomas was unraveling. He cleared his throat once. The sound barely registered. Even the court officers, trained to maintain order, stood in uncertain posture, watching, not waiting for orders, but for history to tip. Then, like a controlled detonation, the voice of U.S. Deputy Counsel Ayla Rendon pierced the silence. She stood up from her seat at the government's table, her federal badge clipped visibly to her blazer, and said firmly, "Madam Clerk, please pause the session. The Department of Justice requests immediate adjournment pending review of newly submitted materials." There was no motion filed, no sidebar, just authority, real authority, spoken without hesitation. Thomas looked at her, but his gaze did not challenge. It registered, slowly, deeply, because for the first time in decades, the balance of power had tilted, and it was no longer in his favor. Rendon continued, her voice level and direct. "In light of the evidence presented and testimonial disclosures, we are initiating a federal ethics investigation into potential violations of judicial conduct codes." Gasps were unnecessary now. The moment didn't need drama. It carried its own gravity. Furthermore, she added, the department finds insufficient cause to proceed against Congresswoman Crockett. The charges are without merit and are hereby nullified in the record. At that, Jasmine, still standing, still silent, closed the folder before her with measured calm. She didn't gloat. She didn't even blink in Thomas's direction. Her stillness now held more weight than any verdict could. Thomas remained seated for a beat longer than was comfortable. The cameras, still live, zoomed in slightly as his hands slowly dropped from the bench to his lap. He looked around the room, not with the practiced detachment of a senior justice, but with the hollowed awareness of a man who realized the room no longer belonged to him. He tried to speak. His mouth parted, then closed again. No words came. There was nothing to salvage, no ground left to stand on. And so, without a single sentence of defense, Clarence Thomas rose. It wasn't the rise of a man in command. It was the slow, reluctant ascent of someone walking away from something already lost. He didn't ask to be dismissed. He didn't issue closing remarks. He simply turned his back to the courtroom he had controlled for the last hour, and the country for far longer, and stepped down from the bench. Every movement was recorded, every step archived. The cameras didn't blink, and neither did the nation. Behind him, the courtroom remained frozen. No one moved. Jasmine stood like a sentinel, unmoved and unmoving, while her legal team sat in silent awe. The clerk's fingers hovered over the keys but didn't type. The security guards by the doors didn't reach for the handles. The only sound was the soft scrape of leather soles on marble tile as the justice who once believed himself untouchable walked out. Not as a symbol, not as a hero, not even as a villain. Just as a man, stripped of the illusion that once cloaked him. And the cameras kept rolling, because accountability, once rare in that room, had finally shown its face. Not as vengeance, not even as victory, but as undeniable consequence. As the heavy doors clicked shut behind Clarence Thomas, leaving behind only the echo of everything he didn't say, all eyes slowly turned, not toward the bench he abandoned, but toward the woman who never needed it to speak with authority. Jasmine didn't rise. She didn't need the elevation. Her voice, clear, grounded, unshaken, cut through the charged air like steel through smoke. She sat exactly where they had tried to silence her, at the defendant's table, now transformed into something far more powerful, a witness stand for the truth. "Let me be clear," she began, her eyes scanning the room, not for approval, but for accountability. "I'm not here to replace him. I don't want that chair. I don't want its weight, its legacy, or its shadow." She leaned forward, her tone steady and intimate, like someone daring the system to look itself in the mirror. "I just want to live in a country where that chair, any chair of power, can't be bought by private jets, handwritten checks, and silence disguised as tradition." She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. "Because justice should never wear a price tag," she continued, each word falling like a verdict. "And respect for the law should come from the people it protects, not the donors it serves." The gallery was still, no shifting, no murmurs, only attention, taut and reverent. In that moment, Jasmine wasn't addressing the court. She was addressing the country, every person watching who had ever wondered if speaking truth to power was worth it. And now they had their answer. And with the weight of corruption laid bare and the gavel of fear finally silenced, Jasmine did not pause to bask in vindication. She moved instead to do what her accusers never expected: rebuild the very system that tried to crush her. Still seated at the defendant's table, Jasmine took a breath. Not out of relief, but out of resolve. She didn't glance toward the press, nor toward the still reeling judicial staff. Her eyes locked instead on the court stenographer and the congressional observers seated in the second row, every one of them scribbling, typing, documenting history as it unfolded in real time. Her voice didn't rise. It deepened. "I request the following be entered into the official record as proposed policy reform," she said, each word as deliberate as a hammer striking iron. The room held its breath again, not out of shock this time, but because they sensed something real, something structural was being born. She raised 3 fingers slowly, not for drama, but for clarity. "First," she said, "a federal statute mandating that all judges, state and federal, publicly disclose any gifts, trips, or financial favors on a quarterly basis. Not annually, not selectively, every quarter, every dollar, no exceptions." The tone in her voice didn't ask for permission. It demanded accountability. "Second," she continued, "an unbreachable protection clause for judicial whistleblowers. We protect those who expose corruption in corporations and Congress. Why not the courts? Without that, truth suffocates before it ever gets to speak." Then came the third. Her voice slowed, not out of fatigue, but gravity. "And third," she said, her eyes narrowing slightly, "the immediate formation of an independent judicial oversight council, fully funded, bipartisan, and outside the control of the executive branch. No judge should ever be immune to scrutiny simply because of their title. Power without inspection is not justice. It's royalty in disguise." A quiet gasp rippled through the back row, not scandalized but stunned. No one in recent memory had said it so plainly, so cleanly in the very room where such statements could cost a career. And yet Jasmine didn't flinch. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was reverent. No one moved. Not a single lawmaker objected. In fact, 2 Senate legal aides immediately began transcribing her language verbatim into draft legislative text. The court recorder looked briefly toward the acting judicial moderator, who nodded solemnly. "Let it be entered." No one asked for clarification. No one called it out of order, because it wasn't just appropriate, it was necessary. Jasmine's proposals weren't political theater. They were blueprints. And the people in that room, many of whom had come expecting a spectacle, now found themselves sitting in the first pages of reform. She closed the folder on the desk in front of her and folded her hands once more. Not as a defendant, not even as a victor, but as a citizen demanding the country she served finally serve its own people back. The weight of what had just happened began to register in the expressions of those around her. A court officer looked down at his badge as if questioning what it meant. A young congressional intern blinked twice, then leaned forward, typing faster than before. One woman from the House Judiciary Committee wiped a single tear, subtle but real. In that moment, the trial was over. But something far more important had begun. Because reform doesn't start in private meetings. It doesn't begin in law books or editorials. It begins where injustice is confronted in public, and someone dares to say, this must change. Jasmine Crockett didn't just survive the system that tried to silence her. She reshaped it while the cameras were still rolling, while the echoes of a fallen gavel still lingered in the room. And not one voice dared to say no. And as the courtroom emptied, its power rearranged, its silence forever altered, the real verdict wasn't handed down inside the chamber. It was delivered by a nation that had just watched the veil of untouchable power get ripped away in real time. Within minutes of the gavel's final strike, the world outside erupted. News anchors interrupted scheduled broadcasts mid-sentence. A CNN chyron blazed across the screen. Jasmine Crockett flips the bench. Clarence Thomas exits in silence. On MSNBC, one stunned legal analyst whispered, "I never thought I'd see the day." Meanwhile, inside newsrooms across New York, D.C., and Los Angeles, editors shouted into headsets, reworking front pages and evening rundowns on the fly. Politico pushed the headline before the ink was dry on their draft. Congresswoman tries for defense, delivers a reckoning instead. But it was the Washington Post that captured the truth with the brutal clarity history demands. Jasmine Crockett just tried a Supreme Court justice. She used facts. He had nothing to say. The livestream replay hit 15 million views in under 2 hours. By the 12th hour, it had crossed 60 million. Twitter collapsed under the weight of hashtags that now felt more like rallying cries than trends. Charged judges are not gods, Jarshi justice without privilege, and who judges the judge? The video clip, just 1 minute and 54 seconds long, of Jasmine calmly asking, "Who holds power accountable when power wears a robe?" was shared over 11 million times before sunrise. And it wasn't just retweets from activists or watchdog groups. Celebrities, veterans, former prosecutors, even retired judges were reposting it with captions like, "Finally, she said what we couldn't," and "that courtroom changed something." The footage looped on every screen: airport terminals, gym televisions, office lobbies, coffee shops in Kansas, and court waiting rooms in Queens. People paused mid-conversation, mid-commute, mid-life to watch the moment Clarence Thomas lowered his gaze and walked away from the bench. For once, the silence of a powerful man spoke louder than any defense he might have offered. Late-night shows canceled comedy segments to address what had just happened. Jimmy Fallon looked straight into the camera and said, "Tonight we were supposed to laugh, but instead we watched history change its posture." On cable networks, the political divide blurred, if only briefly. Even conservative anchors, often loyal to the institution of the court, struggled to find a narrative that made the footage look like anything other than what it was: a reckoning. Fox's Laura Ingraham hesitated on air, her tone uncharacteristically somber, admitting, "I may disagree with her politics, but Congresswoman Crockett demanded accountability. And that's something no American should oppose." And across comment sections, threads, and forum pages, the country wasn't just reacting. They were recalibrating. Posts poured in from public defenders, mothers, veterans, and former clerks. A retired judge from Colorado wrote, 30 years on the bench, and I've never seen anything like that. Not just courage, precision, a moral scalpel." One law school professor assigned the full transcript of Jasmine's testimony for mandatory reading, writing in the syllabus, "Not just legal argument, civic responsibility incarnate." But perhaps most powerful of all were the messages from people who had no microphone, no law degree, no political seat. A high school student in Detroit posted, "I want to be Jasmine Crockett when I grow up." A woman in Houston posted a selfie with the caption, "For the first time, my daughter saw someone in power who looked like us and refused to kneel." And beneath every major news outlet's coverage, pinned to the top comment, was one unshakable truth echoed over and over again. She didn't just win. She changed the rules. Even Congress felt it. By mid-afternoon the next day, 3 different senators from both parties had contacted their staff to inquire about drafting legislation modeled after Jasmine's 3 reform proposals. The buzz inside Capitol Hill was unlike anything in recent memory. Aides reported phones ringing nonstop. Constituents weren't just angry, they were activated. Calls came in not with outrage, but with resolve. We saw what she did. We expect you to follow through. It wasn't about Clarence Thomas anymore. It was about a culture that had long allowed robes to serve as armor and silence as strategy. Jasmine Crockett had cracked that armor, not with rage, but with restraint, not with partisanship, but with proof, not with spectacle, but with systemic truth. And people felt that. They knew it instinctively. They'd seen outrage before, theatrics before. But this was different. This was surgical, controlled, inevitable. By the end of that first night, over a dozen op-eds had been drafted, each one trying to capture what exactly had happened inside that courtroom. Some called it a judicial earthquake. Others labeled it a masterclass in democratic resilience. But the title that gained the most traction came from a simple blog post by a former law clerk in Chicago. It read, "She cross-examined a justice without leaving her seat." And in the end, that was the truth that stuck. Because Jasmine Crockett didn't need a robe, a gavel, or a bench. She didn't need to yell. She didn't need to beg. All she needed was the truth, and the will to say it where it wasn't welcome. And once she did, America didn't just listen. It stood up. But the shock waves didn't stop at the courthouse steps. In fact, the real tremor hadn't hit until Congress, staring at a nation newly awake, realized it had no choice but to act or be buried by its own silence. Just 72 hours after Jasmine Crockett left that courtroom, Congress moved with a swiftness rarely seen outside times of war or impeachment. On a stormy Monday morning, beneath skies that seemed to echo the weight of the moment, a bipartisan emergency session was convened in the Hart Senate office building. The room was standing room only. Senators, House members, legal scholars, and journalists crammed shoulder to shoulder, eyes fixed on the placards before them. Special Investigatory Committee on Federal Judicial Ethics. It wasn't just a hearing, it was a signal, a line drawn in marble. The committee's formation came after an emergency closed-door vote, passing 91-7 in the Senate and unanimously in the House Ethics Subcommittee, a level of consensus not seen in years. What Jasmine had ignited had become more than a scandal. It had become a mirror, and no one wanted to be caught on the wrong side of it when the nation was still watching, still sharing, still demanding more. The hashtag number sign oversight or obsolete had trended worldwide just the night before. One congressman was overheard muttering, "We miss me too. We won't miss this." Within its first 48 hours, the committee issued formal disclosure demands to 4 sitting federal judges, including 2 appellate justices with ties to the same benefactor network exposed during Jasmine's hearing. The language of the requests was sharp and unflinching. Failure to provide complete records may result in immediate suspension pending further review under federal ethics code. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a reckoning. Reporters descended like hawks, lining the marble corridors of the Rayburn building, as aides scurried past with sealed envelopes and expressionless faces. The committee chair, Representative Linda Ashbourne, a moderate from Ohio not known for firebrand politics, stood before a sea of microphones and declared, "We are no longer asking whether misconduct exists within the federal judiciary. We are asking how deep it runs and who let it fester." The cameras loved her, but the public loved something more: action. Subpoenas were drafted that same afternoon. Inside chambers, white-gloved clerks were ordered to pull a decade's worth of judicial travel records, private asset declarations, and sealed advisory memos. And for the first time in modern memory, the Judicial Conference, long considered an impenetrable old boys club, received a congressional demand for cooperation under penalty of defunding. The air had changed. The fear was no longer on the faces of the accused, but on those who had enabled the silence for years. 3 federal judges, under growing public scrutiny, released hurried statements claiming they had inadvertently omitted certain gifts, investments, or personal hospitality from their reports. But the tone was different now, defensive, desperate, and no one was buying it. One document revealed that a sitting judge had received a fully funded safari retreat in Botswana, valued at $82,000, just weeks before ruling in favor of a multinational oil company tied to the trip's sponsor. It was no longer just about Clarence Thomas. It was about a culture, a machinery, a myth of untouchability that had, at last, met resistance. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett was not in front of cameras. She declined all requests for interviews. She didn't tweet. She didn't release a statement. Instead, she returned to committee hearings, housing forums, and town halls, still dressed in muted colors, still carrying a plain leather folder, still answering every question with calm precision. When asked by a young intern in a hallway what she felt about the investigation, she simply said, "I'm glad they're looking. But this isn't about me. This is about the rot we pretended wasn't there." Back in the Capitol, whispers of legislation became drafts. 3 reform bills were introduced within 5 days, each citing Crockett disclosure standards as their model. Staffers worked overnight. Veteran lawmakers who had long tiptoed around judicial accountability now leaned into it with both hands. Behind closed doors, some admitted they had waited years for a moment like this. A name, a face, and a fire they could stand behind without looking like opportunists. And Jasmine had given them that, not by asking, not by shouting, but by enduring, confronting, and refusing to flinch when everything was thrown at her. The pressure didn't let up. Protesters stood outside federal courthouses in 22 states holding cardboard gavels and wearing black robes with dollar signs drawn in red. Law school students organized nationwide accountability audits, cross-referencing financial disclosures with rulings for signs of bias. A single spreadsheet created by a Berkeley grad student mapping gifts and decisions went viral, accumulating over 9 million views in a day. America wasn't watching anymore. It was working. And in one of the most unexpected moves yet, the American Bar Association released a rare public statement calling for mandatory third-party financial auditing of federal judges, backed by over 400 retired judges and justices. It read, "We do not question the need for judicial independence. But independence without scrutiny is no longer justice. It is theater." By the end of the week, the committee had grown from 7 members to 15, with co-chairs from both parties, and a mandate expanded to include review of lifetime appointments, lobbying contacts, and post-retirement speaking fees. For the first time in American legal history, the term ethical audit began appearing on official Judiciary Committee documents. The system had blinked, and none had been possible before that single afternoon when one congresswoman in a storm of accusation had turned the mirror back on the people holding it. Jasmine Crockett didn't just challenge a verdict, she cracked open an institution and made it bleed enough to matter. And the country, hungry, furious, awake, did the rest. The courtroom may have gone quiet, but the system had only just begun to speak. Even as the storm she had unleashed surged into every corner of the country, Jasmine Crockett stepped out of the courthouse, not as a politician basking in triumph, but as a woman who had walked through fire carrying truth and refused to let it be turned into spectacle. The steps outside the courthouse were a wall of sound, reporters shouting her name, camera shutters snapping like a machine gun volley, a frenzy of microphones lunging forward as she emerged into the open air. The flash of lights lit her face in bursts, but she didn't blink. Her eyes were forward, unfazed, her walk unhurried. She wasn't hiding, but she wasn't here to perform either. Around her, the crowd surged with questions. Do you believe this will change the court? Is Clarence Thomas fit to remain on the bench? Congresswoman, will you be filing ethics legislation yourself? A dozen questions a second, and every journalist in the pack hoping to be the one she acknowledged. But Jasmine kept her folder tucked tight beneath her arm, her expression composed. Not detached, not cold, but focused, as if her work was still unfinished. She didn't stop at the first row of microphones. She didn't stop at the second either. It wasn't until she reached the third step from the bottom, where the press line thinned and only one camera crew remained, that she paused. A young CNN reporter, eyes wide with urgency and reverence, leaned forward slightly, not shouting like the others. Her voice was low, respectful. Congresswoman Crockett, what did this moment mean to you? Jasmine turned to face her, just for a second. The flashbulbs dimmed. The noise seemed to drop. There was no triumph in her posture, no victory grin, no righteous finger-pointing, just exhaustion tempered by resolve. Then she said with a clarity that cut through the chaos like a scalpel through noise, "I didn't come here to win. I came to end the things we let live in the dark. The things we don't talk about but still let hold power over us. That ends now." The reporter didn't speak, neither did the cameras. For a moment, the entire crowd was still. Not because of drama, because of truth. It was not a quote made for headlines. It was a sentence carved from lived reality, a reminder that some battles aren't about applause, but about drawing lines where no one dared before. Then Jasmine turned away, descended the final steps, and walked into the street, not surrounded by handlers, not trailing an entourage, but moving with the quiet force of someone who had just told the system it could no longer pretend not to see itself. But Jasmine Crockett had no interest in being remembered for a moment, no matter how explosive. It was the aftermath she cared about, and what came next would prove she hadn't just confronted power, she was already reshaping it. Exactly 7 days after the hearing that changed the course of public trust in the judiciary, a sealed envelope arrived at the Office of Legislative Counsel, its contents already whispered about in every corridor of Capitol Hill. Typed across the front in plain black ink were 5 words: Judicial Transparency Act of 2025. No dramatics, no branding. Just the beginning of a new fight, on her terms. It wasn't drafted by a committee of consultants or shaped to appease donors. Jasmine had written every section herself, long after the cameras were gone, working through nights fueled by conviction rather than headlines. The language was unflinching. Quarterly disclosure of all gifts and financial favors for all federal judges, lifetime bans on accepting benefits from litigants or lobbyists, mandatory ethics audits conducted by an independent oversight council reporting to Congress. Not the executive. It was the kind of bill that, months earlier, would have been dismissed as idealistic. Now it was undeniable. The document hit the desks of lawmakers like a lightning bolt. Within 6 hours, the signatures began to appear, first from progressives, then centrists, and then, stunningly, from the other side of the aisle, a Republican from Utah, a moderate from Pennsylvania. By sunset, both parties had signed on as co-sponsors, a symbolic and strategic move that sent a clear message. Jasmine Crockett's call for accountability had crossed the red-blue divide. It wasn't politics anymore. It was necessity. The Judiciary Committee fast-tracked it for reading, and by Friday, hearings were scheduled for early markup. Even the oldest, most jaded staffers couldn't remember a reform bill moving this fast without the backdrop of national tragedy. But this had been a tragedy, just one that had finally been recorded, replayed, and no longer ignored. As the news broke, the New York Times didn't waste a second. The headline ran bold and unapologetic across its Sunday front page. From defendant to architect, Crockett's judicial reform gains unlikely momentum. In the lead paragraph, the piece captured what millions were already thinking. What was expected to be a public fall from grace has instead become the foundation of a bipartisan movement. The hearing that was supposed to end Jasmine Crockett's career may instead have revived the very soul of judicial oversight. Editorial boards across the country followed suit. The Boston Globe called it the most meaningful post-Roberts era judicial bill introduced in 2 decades. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution referred to Crockett as the reluctant fire starter of a badly needed legal reckoning. Cable news ran segment after segment, not just on the bill, but on the fact that it had been born not in a lobbyist's office, but in the crucible of injustice, right there in front of the American people. And the public responded in kind. Over 3 million citizens signed an online petition in support of the bill within the first 4 days. Town halls exploded in attendance, not in protest, but in unified demand. Pass the act, clean the bench. One viral video showed a group of high school students in Newark holding a mock judiciary hearing with a cardboard gavel, chanting, "Crockett's Law Now." It wasn't just a political moment. It had become a civic education, something that people could see, name, and believe in. And through it all, Jasmine never shifted her tone. She refused to speak in slogans. When asked if she thought the bill would pass, she answered simply, "If it doesn't, we'll reintroduce it. If it's watered down, we'll rewrite it. But we won't unsee what we've seen. Not anymore." Her office issued no fancy promotional graphics, no fundraising emails quoting her testimony, just the full text of the bill, available online in 10 languages, with a bold link that read, "Read it, then hold us to it." The message had landed. This wasn't about left or right. It was about something older and more sacred, the expectation that justice, once broken open, must answer for itself. And Jasmine Crockett had not only answered. She'd handed the country the pen and said, "Write better laws." She didn't need to say she'd changed the conversation. Every newsroom, every legal institution, every household that once believed courts were beyond reach now knew. One voice, spoken without fear, could call an entire branch of government to the stand. And this time, the people weren't just listening. They were writing history with her. But while Washington trembled and legislation moved with historic speed, Jasmine Crockett didn't linger in the spotlight. She returned to the only courtroom that had ever truly mattered to her, the community that sent her to fight in the first place. She was back in Texas before the headlines had even cooled, her name still trending, her bill still being dissected by legal analysts and political strategists. But Jasmine wasn't pacing marble corridors or basking in the heat of national acclaim. She was walking into neighborhood centers lit by flickering fluorescence, where folding chairs creaked and coffee was served in styrofoam cups. She held no press conferences. There were no velvet robes, no handlers, just chalkboards behind her and folding tables in front, scattered with handwritten questions and notepads passed between retirees, veterans, single mothers, and students in scuffed sneakers. In one room, the ceiling fan rattled so loudly she had to raise her voice just slightly to be heard. But she never complained. She answered every question, never watching the clock. It was in one of those rooms, a municipal rec center just outside of Dallas, the windows fogged by winter, that a moment unfolded that would etch itself into history deeper than any headline. The town hall had been going for 90 minutes when an older woman stood from the back row, her cane clicking softly against the linoleum floor. She wore a dark green coat that hung a little loose at the shoulders, and her hair was pinned in the careful way of someone who still believed in dignity before speaking. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was unshakable. "Jasmine," she said, "you didn't take down a man." The room went still. Jasmine turned to face her fully. "You brought the whole system back to the ground," the woman continued, "just so it'd remember. It once served people, not power." The silence that followed wasn't stunned. It was reverent. Jasmine didn't respond right away. She didn't need to. The words had landed where they needed to, deep in the gut of every person present. One by one, heads nodded, first subtly, then without hesitation. No applause, just acknowledgement. And Jasmine, who had faced down one of the most powerful institutions in America, stood there like she always had, not above the people, but among them. That single sentence, the one spoken by a woman whose name was never printed in papers, spread faster than any campaign slogan. Within days, it was quoted on podcast intros, etched into protest signs, and painted in murals outside community centers. "You didn't take down a man. You brought the system back to the ground." The words weren't about vengeance. They were about restoration, reminding a nation that systems should kneel to the people, not the other way around. And yet it was the second sentence, the one that came next, quiet and untelevised, that would echo in a very different place. Law schools across the country, Stanford, Howard, Yale, Texas Southern, began quoting it not as poetry, but as precedent. It appeared first in a classroom in Baltimore, handwritten in chalk across a blackboard left up for days. When one person dares to tell the truth in open court, power starts to tremble. By week's end, the quote had been translated into Spanish, Vietnamese, Arabic, and Swahili, hung above lecture halls and printed at the top of ethics syllabi. Professors called it the Crockett Principle. Students called it a call to arms. And judges, those who still believed in the robes they wore, read it with equal parts pride and warning. For the first time in decades, the legal profession was no longer speaking about judicial power as an immovable object, but as a mirror that needed cleaning. Back in Texas, Jasmine didn't tweet about it. She didn't post pictures of the quote being shared. But when asked by a law student during a Q&A what she thought of the phrase, she smiled. Not wide, not proud, just quietly, and said, "I didn't write it, but I lived it, and I hope none of you ever have to, unless you must." Because that was the heart of it. Jasmine hadn't gone looking for a fight with a Supreme Court justice. She hadn't written a speech for a headline or scripted a takedown for applause. She had simply refused to lie, when lying would have been safer, easier, and far more profitable. She had stepped into a courtroom not to perform, but to defend herself with the only weapon she had ever trusted: truth. And the world had trembled not because of how loud she spoke, but because she never backed away from the silence that came before it. But beyond the headlines, beyond the hashtags, beyond the historic reform bills and the silence of a disgraced justice, there lies something deeper, something more lasting, the human lesson born from a woman's refusal to surrender in the face of impossible odds. What Jasmine Crockett did was not just brave, it was costly. She stood before an institution designed to erase dissent, and she refused to flinch, not because she believed she would win, but because she believed losing with her voice intact was better than surviving in silence. That is where the heart of this story lies, not in the gavel that fell, not in the judge who crumbled, but in the moment Jasmine chose to speak, knowing the machine might crush her for it. It would have been easier to stay quiet, to play the political game, to absorb the injustice with a tight jaw and wait for it to pass. But Jasmine Crockett didn't come from the halls of privilege. She came from the spaces where justice is not promised, but fought for daily, where silence has always been the enemy of survival. She knew that if she didn't speak that day, the next Black woman sitting at that table wouldn't get the chance. And that knowledge, that quiet, personal burden, is what transformed her defiance into something far greater than a political moment. Because courage is not just standing up. It's standing still while the weight of a system tries to break your spine. It's holding eye contact with those who are betting on your collapse. It's knowing that truth doesn't guarantee safety and still choosing to tell it anyway. Jasmine stood in that courtroom not with armor, but with history behind her. She carried the voices of women like her who had been locked out of power, of courtrooms, of truth itself. She carried every false accusation, every closed door, every condescending stare that told her she didn't belong. And she turned that history into a weapon, not to destroy, but to reveal. Because some systems don't need to be torn down with rage. They just need to be seen clearly. And that clarity alone is enough to make them fall. And what happened in the days after wasn't just a shift in politics. It was a shift in moral gravity. For decades, Americans had been told, implicitly and explicitly, that judges were untouchable, that the law policed itself, that oversight was mistrust, that questioning power was somehow a threat to the balance. But Jasmine didn't just question power. She placed it under oath. She asked the question that every American has wanted to ask but was too afraid to say aloud. Who judges the judges? And when no answer came, when the most powerful man in the room chose silence over accountability, the public finally understood. This wasn't about one case. This was about an entire system that had forgotten who it worked for. The lesson, then, is terrifying in its simplicity. Unchecked power will always bend toward self-preservation unless someone is willing to stand in its path. Jasmine did, alone. And the entire country saw that when she stood, the illusion shattered. Because when a system depends on fear to function, the moment someone refuses to be afraid, it loses its grip. She did not storm the bench. She did not call for chaos. She simply spoke, and power recoiled. That is the most dangerous thing you can do in a broken structure. Remind it that it's accountable to the people it was built to serve. There is something profoundly human about that choice. Jasmine didn't come in with certainty. She didn't know the cameras would catch her words. She didn't know the judge would falter. She didn't know the law would shift in her wake. All she knew was that something had to be said, and that it would cost her more to stay silent than it would to risk speaking. That kind of clarity doesn't come from ambition. It comes from memory, from having lived the cost of silence before, from having felt the weight of a false accusation and vowed never to let another person carry it alone. Jasmine brought that memory into the courtroom like a second skin, and when the system tried to paint her as the problem, she responded with facts, with documents, with undeniable receipts, and in doing so, made clear who the problem really was. What followed, laws, headlines, resignations, was secondary. The real shift happened in the invisible places, in the breath people held when she spoke, in the classrooms where her words now line the walls, in the quiet understanding between citizens that the law is not a fortress, but a mirror, and it will only reflect what we are willing to look at. So what, then, is the lesson? That justice is not inevitable, it is not automatic, it is not permanent. Justice must be chosen, justice must be fought for, justice must be protected, not just by those in power, but by those willing to risk everything when power goes too far. Jasmine Crockett reminded us that the law belongs to the people, not to titles, not to robes, not to those whose names are carved into stone above courthouses, but to the ones who walk through those doors with nothing but truth and still refuse to bow. That is the true legacy of her story. Not that she survived the system, but that she changed its shape with nothing more than courage and clarity. And perhaps the most powerful part of that truth is that any of us can do the same. But Jasmine's story was never meant to be the final word. It was meant to be the first shot in a war for accountability, a call echoing in every hallway of power, in every quiet place where injustice survives, because no one dares to challenge it. Now, the question isn't what happened to her. The question is, what will we do with what we've seen? Because after everything she endured, after the silence she broke, and the system she exposed, Jasmine Crockett didn't ask for applause. She asked for action. She didn't ask to be lifted up on shoulders. She asked that we stop looking the other way. And now if you're reading this, if you followed her story, if your heart raced when the courtroom froze and the truth finally spoke louder than the robe, then this moment belongs to you too. You are not a bystander anymore. You're a witness. And with that comes a responsibility no one gets to outsource. Because power only survives unchecked when good people choose comfort over confrontation, when we accept the lie that the law belongs to the powerful instead of remembering it was built to protect the vulnerable. It starts with knowing. Read the bill, the Judicial Transparency Act of 2025. Don't wait for filtered headlines. Don't let politicians define its meaning for you. The words inside it were forged in the fire of a woman's public humiliation and private courage. Learn them, quote them, share them. Send them to your representative and demand to know, do you support this, or are you waiting for the next scandal to pretend you care? Don't let them hide behind procedure. Demand a vote, demand public positions, demand clarity. Because if you stay quiet now, you're telling the next Jasmine that when the system comes for her, she'll be on her own. And this goes deeper than legislation. It means calling out hypocrisy when you see it, in courtrooms, classrooms, newsrooms. It means checking the financial disclosures of those who rule on your life, but think they answer to no one. It means supporting whistleblowers, not doubting them. It means remembering that truth doesn't survive because it's popular. It survives because someone defends it when it's not. Jasmine did, but she should never have had to do it alone. You can organize. You can protest. You can run for office. You can pressure those already in power to pass the reforms she proposed. Demand quarterly disclosures from judges. Demand protections for court staff who speak up. Demand an independent oversight council, not tied to any party, not answerable to any president. This isn't radical. This is baseline integrity. And if you think it's too idealistic, ask yourself who benefits from your cynicism, because it's never the people being stepped on. Talk to your friends. Start with one person. Share the clip. Tell them what she did, what it cost her, and what it exposed. Remind them that while the cameras are off now, the rot she uncovered is still embedded in the system, still hiding behind titles and tradition and silence. Jasmine cracked it open. It's on us to tear it out, not through outrage for a week, but through sustained, unrelenting pressure. Because that's the only thing power respects. And if you ever wonder whether it's worth the fight, if calling your congressperson matters, if joining a local oversight committee makes a dent, if challenging a judge's record means anything. Remember this: a single congresswoman, cornered by accusations designed to destroy her, walked into a courtroom and made the most powerful man in that room walk out in silence. Not with fury, not with vengeance, with truth. That is what accountability looks like when someone stops asking for permission to speak and simply does. So don't wait for permission either, because the real danger isn't that Jasmine Crockett was targeted. The real danger is if we let them get away with it. This is your moment now. Don't miss it. Don't waste it. And above all, don't stay silent. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.